Today, we look back on slavery as one of the greatest evils in human history, but for centuries, it was accepted, justified, and upheld by society. Moral, legal, and religious institutions supported it, framing it as necessary for social order and prosperity. This raises an unsettling question. How could something so horrifying have once been seen as moral? What does this tell us about the nature of good and evil? It shows us that these concepts are not fixed. They are fluid, shaped by the culture, society, and those in power. What one era views as virtuous can later be condemned as evil. If buying and selling human beings was once accepted as moral, how can we be sure that our own judgments are universal truths? Perhaps the morality we accept today is just as shaped by the structures of power and society as it was in the past. This forces us to question, are good and evil truly universal, or are they constructs molded by the forces of history? Friedrich Nietzsche is often described as one of the most radical critics of traditional morality. His work challenges the very foundations of moral philosophy by asking a simple yet profound question. Why do we believe in good and evil in the first place? Nietzsche's critique begins with the rejection of what he called slave morality. He argued that the values of humility, obedience, and meekness, what we typically associate with goodness in a Christian moral framework, were not virtues of the powerful, but rather of the weak. In his work on the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche explores how morality developed not from a sense of universal goodness, but from a struggle between two groups, the masters and the slaves. According to Nietzsche, master morality was the morality of the strong and the powerful. To the masters, good was whatever affirmed their strength and vitality, courage, pride, ambition, and dominance. Evil to them was weakness or submission. However, over time, the weaker class, the slaves, developed their own morality as a way of coping with their powerlessness. They began to frame their virtues, like humility and self-denial, as good and painted the master's virtues, strength, pride, and power as evil. Thus, Nietzsche suggests that morality is a creation, born not of divine authority or inherent truth, but of conflict. The values we hold dear today, like compassion and humility, are not universal. They are born out of resentment and weakness, a slave revolt in morality. What does this mean for us? Nietzsche's challenge is to rethink our assumptions about moral values. Are we blindly accepting a morality designed to suppress vitality and strength? Or can we forge our own values, free from the historical baggage of good and evil? Nietzsche leaves us with a provocative thought. If God is dead, if there is no divine moral order, then we must take on the burden of creating values ourselves. While Nietzsche focused on the historical and power-laden roots of morality, Michel Foucault took this critique further by examining how institutions of power create and enforce moral norms. For Foucault, power is not just a force that oppresses or dominates. It's a force that creates knowledge, truth, and crucially, morality. In Foucault's work, power is everywhere. It permeates society through systems of governance, law, medicine, and even education. These institutions don't just enforce rules. They define what is normal, what is healthy, and what is moral. And through this process, they shape not only our behavior, but also our understanding of what it means to be good or evil. Take, for instance, the idea of madness. In the Middle Ages, madness was seen as a form of divine inspiration or a cosmic imbalance. But as modern institutions like psychiatry developed, madness became a pathology, a moral illness to be treated and corrected. Similarly, sexuality, which was once a matter of private life, was regulated by institutions like the church, and later the medical field, which categorized behaviors as either moral or immoral. Foucault's key insight is that morality is not an abstract concept. It's a product of power relations. Through what he called discourse, institutions define what counts as moral or immoral, and these definitions shift based on the needs of those in power. For Foucault, morality is not something we discover. It's something we create, consciously or unconsciously, through systems of power and knowledge. As societies change, so too do their moral codes, showing us once again that good and evil are far from universal. But how does this philosophy play out in history? Can we truly say that morality is just a product of power without objective standards? Consider one of the most horrifying events in modern history, the Holocaust. At the time, the Nazi regime justified this atrocity as necessary for the purification of society, framing it as a moral duty. Entire populations were targeted in the name of an ideology that, within its own twisted framework, was seen as righteous by those in power. Today, we look back at such events with absolute moral condemnation, as we should, but they remind us that moral judgments are not static. They evolve as societies shift. The same actions once seen as just or moral can later be recognized as atrocities. This historical fluidity of moral judgment highlights the danger of moral absolutism. When morality is tied to power, it becomes a tool to justify oppression, violence, and domination. The lesson here isn't that everything is permissible, but that we must remain deeply critical of moral systems that present themselves as eternal or unchangeable. Moral relativism asks us to question these systems, to see them not as universal truths, but as contingent products of their time and place. Of course, not everyone agrees with the idea that morality is fluid or subjective. Some philosophers argue for the existence of objective moral truths, principles that hold regardless of time, culture, or context. Immanuel Kant, for instance, believed in what he called the categorical imperative, a universal moral law that is binding on all rational beings. According to Kant, certain actions like lying or stealing are inherently wrong because they violate the principle of treating others as ends in themselves, not as means to an end. For Kant, the idea that morality is merely a product of power would lead to a dangerous moral ambiguity. Other critics argue that moral relativism could lead to moral paralysis. If all moral judgments are subjective, then what stops us from excusing any behavior? Without some kind of objective standard, they argue, how can we condemn atrocities like genocide or slavery without falling into the trap of it's all relative? But proponents of moral relativism respond that this critique misunderstands the point. Moral relativism doesn't mean that anything goes. Instead, it urges us to be more reflective, to constantly examine the power dynamics behind moral systems, and to avoid the dangers of moral certainty that have historically justified some of humanity's darkest moments. So, what does it mean to live in a world without absolute moral truths? How do we navigate the uncertainty of moral relativism in our daily lives? For many, the realization that morality is fluid can be unsettling. If there are no universal principles guiding us, how do we know what is right or wrong? But this uncertainty can also be liberating. It means that we are not bound by rigid systems of thought or oppressive power structures. Instead, we have the freedom and the responsibility to create our own values. In today's world, where power structures are constantly shifting, we must be vigilant in questioning the moral systems that govern us. Whether it's laws about human rights, norms about gender, or economic systems, we must recognize that these systems are not neutral. They are products of power, and they can be changed. Moral relativism doesn't ask us to abandon morality. It asks us to become active participants in its creation. It asks us to be critical, reflective, and engaged in the ongoing project of defining what is good and what is evil in our own time. In conclusion, both Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault challenge us to rethink the way we understand morality. Good and evil are not eternal truths handed down from on high. They are constructed by human societies, shaped by power dynamics, and subject to change. As we've seen, this view has profound implications for how we live our lives. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the origins of our values, and it calls on us to take responsibility for shaping those values ourselves. In a world without absolute moral truths, the challenge is not to find the right answers, but to remain critical of the systems that claim to have them. It's up to us to question, to reflect, and to never stop seeking understanding in the ever-shifting landscape of morality.